Great, you're live.
Hi, everybody. Sorry to be keeping you. There's just lots of emergencies coming up day by day, including Ebola. So I was just talking about that with our local media, and I apologize for the delay. I hope the course is going well, and happy to have a chance to spend some time with you. So we'll get right to the questions. We have a question from Elke Schnabel, Professor Sachs. We've learned a lot about the role of the US, Canada, and Australia in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process. Back
live.
Hi, I don't know how long I was off and whether you're still there, and we've lost the questions on the screen, but I'll finish the question I was discussing from Elke, and hopefully the others will come back on screen shortly. I was saying that in the original UN Framework Convention, the idea was that the rich countries would move first, and the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997, was based on that, but it didn't work. And it didn't work basically for two reasons. One, the United States balked, meaning that it did not follow through on its word. The idea was that the US would be leader according to this Annex 1 agreement. And then the US Senate said, no way, we're not doing this unless the developing countries also join in. And the developing countries, in this case led by China, said that's not fair, you just signed an agreement. And of course, the United States was really breaking the rules badly. The second reason it didn't work is that substantively, the developing countries became such a big part of the overall process of emissions that even the rich countries, even if they had meant to, by themselves would not be the full share of, or an adequate share of the total emissions. So legally, the developing countries were right. Practically, all countries need to participate. And that's why the idea for 2015 is that we have to move beyond this Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distinction, and all countries need to do actions in 2015 and onward. Of course, the actions that they take should be calibrated to their level of economic development. The poor countries are not major emitters by definition. They don't use that much commercial energy of any kind, including fossil fuels. They're not the source of the world problem, and they need more time to incur extra costs. Also, developing countries rightly say that the richer countries need to pay for part of the mitigation effort. But it will be true this time around that all countries need to sign on to binding commitments. And perhaps the biggest change from 1992, when the convention was first signed, 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and today is China. China is now a upper middle income country. It will soon be a high income country. China now is the world's largest economy in overall size when measured at purchasing power parity prices. And China is by far the world's largest greenhouse gas emitting nation, emitting around 27 or 28% of total emissions. There is no solution without China. Indeed, the hope right now is that the three biggest economic regions of the world, China, the US, and the European Union, will all agree to a framework for moving forward, and that will bring the rest of the world along with it, as long as the basic terms are fair for the poor as well as the rich countries. So I think
next question?
Okay.
You'll stay on that.
Oh, okay.
I know.
So the next question, oops, how do I pull that up? Hold on.
It's already opened.
It's open, okay. Kurt Bradner is asking, it's been said that whoever controls the media controls the public mind. Given that Rupert Murdoch and the Koch brothers control a significant portion of the media, there's little surprise about public awareness. So what can be done about this? This is absolutely an important point, that we have the Murdoch press and media in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, taking a very deliberate big oil propagandistic approach and a very anti-science approach, and playing an important political role because of that. The Wall Street Journal, which is our leading business press in the United States, is almost a propaganda page on its opinion page when it comes to climate change. Just about every opinion column that it runs is against the broad consensus view on these issues. They downplay the risks. They exaggerate the scientific doubts. They're very irresponsible. And we've seen this from other major media. What's amazing is that despite all of that, the broad public opinion in the United States is recognizing how important this issue is. The broad public in the United States says that the climate is changing. Most of those who say the climate is changing say it's changing because of human activity. And a very significant majority of Americans, something like 2/3 of opinion respondents, say that we should be moving to a renewable energy-based economy, investing much more in renewable energy. Public opinion's not the main obstacle, actually. The main obstacle is the direct power of the big oil industry, because even with all their propaganda, the American people and people around the world can see the climate's changing. We just had the most recent data from the US government showing that the month of September worldwide was the warmest September on the instrument record. That means since 1880, 134 years, September was the warmest September. August was the warmest August. I think May and June, or April, May, and June were also the warmest respective months for those months as well. 2014 is likely to be the warmest year on record. We'll see by the end of the year, but it looks that that is the tendency. There are major climatological upheavals around the world, droughts, floods, heat waves this year. The public gets it, but the power of the vested interests, the money that they can bring to bear, the lobbying power, the campaign financing, and all the rest is tremendously large. And so the big oil sector has a lot of power way beyond its ability to convince people of what isn't the case. And therefore, even the media can be overcome, but the power of these entrenched interests financially in a country like the United States, where money counts for campaign financing, is very large, and it is a big part of the problem. So here's another question. Should I?
Yeah. Peter Sampson.
So Peter Sampson asks, do I see the global divestment movement having a major role to play? Good question, Peter. The divestment movement is calling on major investors, whether it is pension funds or university endowments or family investment pools like the Rockefeller Family Foundation, to pull out of fossil fuel investments. And the argument that's being made is a very good and interesting one as well. And that is the following. If we want to stay safe and that has been defined in diplomatic terms as keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial temperature level. We have to cut back greenhouse gas emissions, and especially carbon dioxide emissions, very sharply. And more specifically, we can say that to live within the 2 degrees Celsius limit, we need to honor a carbon budget, meaning that there's a limit to how much fossil fuel can be used and still remain below 2 degrees Celsius. And the best estimate of that is that at most we can burn about 875 billion tons of CO2 emission from fossil fuel use. That's less than 30 years at the current rate. Yet if you look at the proved reserves, already known, identified, economically accessible of coal, oil, and gas, that's many billions of, many trillions of tons, I should say, of carbon dioxide. The point is we have more fossil fuel already in proved reserves than can be safely used. We have to leave some of that coal, oil, and gas under the ground. That idea, which is the result of basic climate carbon arithmetic, has now been called the problem of stranded assets. That a stranded asset is a capital asset, could be a machine, it could be a building. In this case, it's proved reserves of fossil fuel that can't safely be used. It's stranded. And the argument of the divestment movement is that if you take into account the stranded assets of the fossil fuel industry, that's not such a good investment anymore, because that industry won't be able to use all that it already owns in proved reserves, and it's wasting money on making new investments for exploration and development. Now, some of the big oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell have said, oh, we just don't believe in the 2 degrees Celsius limit. I find that a little bit obnoxious, I have to say. Who are they to both wreck the planet and say they don't agree with the limits? We as citizens need to say the world needs to be safe for us and for the coming generations, and the companies need to respect those planetary boundaries. So I think the divestment movement has a point, an important point, which is that the fossil fuel industry is not really telling its shareholders an accurate story right now. Why is the fossil fuel industry spending so much money on exploring for fossil fuels that are not safe to use in the future? And the power of that argument is starting to be felt not only in environmental movements and not only in social impact investment funds, but in the mainstream. There are now mainstream public investment pools like public pensions, or private investment pools like the Rockefeller Family Foundation, which said we're pulling out of the fossil fuel industry. This is opening up eyes. It's also part of a more general movement calling for disclosure of the risks of stranded assets by the individual oil, gas, and coal companies. I believe we should keep the pressure up. These companies need to say they're on side, they respect the science, they respect the carbon budget, they're going to live within it, and that they need to show us a plan to live within it. And I think that the divestment movement is at least having the effect of pressing this industry to get straight, get honest, get transparent, and show how they can be part of the solution, not only part of the problem. So Leah Barber asks, given the slow time frame for a new treaty to become operational only in 2020, are there provisions in the new draft being prepared for Lima that address immediate steps to be taken by nations during the next critical years? So here we are, our global emergency, and what has been agreed is a little disappointing, even in the best of terms, which is that when the Copenhagen COP15 failed to produce a global agreement. The next year at Cancun, the signatories to the UN Framework Convention said, we'll set an agreement in 2015. That's why COP21 in Paris is so important, because the decision was taken that 2015 will be the year to finally overcome this obstacle of disagreement globally. But when they said that 2015 would be the year, that's the year to initial a new agreement. In order for such an agreement to go into force, it has to be ratified in some way, depending on each country's constitution, so that the treaty, if it is a treaty or agreement, goes in force when a sufficient number of countries have ratified it. The target is that this will take place by 2018. So there will be 3 years to put the 2015 agreement into force. And then the idea is that, well, it'll be agreed in 2018 and it will start January 1, 2020. So even in the best of terms, with a strong agreement next year, the legal force of that agreement will be 5 years after. And as Leah rightly asks, we are accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What can and should be done beforehand? The idea, which is by no means a sure thing, is that governments will agree, and business also will join in, on, I hope, 3 time horizons. One is the period up to 2020 to take short-term steps that could make a big difference. One of them, just as an example, is to stop flaring natural gas and to stop the massive leakages of natural gas that are putting methane into the atmosphere directly. And methane, CH4, has a greenhouse effect or a radiative forcing that, depending on the time scale, is more than 20 times that of carbon dioxide. So there are very short-term steps that absolutely should be taken. Then the second time horizon will be perhaps 2025 or 2030, which will be a commitment by governments on a legally binding set of measures to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. I'm arguing for a third time horizon as well, and that would be a mid-century commitment of every government to put forward a plan for deep decarbonization, what my colleagues and I call a deep decarbonization pathway, or DDP. We're urging that in the agreement next year, even though such a mid-century agreement would not be legally binding in the same way because it would be based on a lot more uncertainty around technologies, that every country would at least bind itself legally to present such a DDP to the international community. I think this would be quite powerful, because for the first time we would be debating essentially the decarbonization of the world energy system in a quantitative, practical, technology-based manner. So Leah, the conclusion is we need an agreement that respects 3 time horizons. One is the years up to 2020 to do things even before the new protocol goes into force. A second is a legally binding set of actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 or 2030. And the third is a deep decarbonization pathway put forward by each government to the year 2050. I should add that Europe, yesterday at the European Commission, and European Union, has adopted a roadmap that calls for a 40% reduction of emissions by 2030 en route to a still much deeper set of emissions reductions by 2050. This is an important step. I have not yet read yesterday's agreement. It's just hot off the press. I think we can find it online. But I take it that while some people argue that Europe could be doing more, that this is a quite positive step, actually, of Europe, and one that I hope energizes China and the United States and other major emitting countries to take similar commitments by 2030, but then even deeper commitments in deep decarbonization pathways by 2050. So Salome asks the question, Professor Sachs, what do you think about the option of a world cap and trade system where a carbon market regulates the decarbonization of our economies, compensates growing economies, and provides incentives for sustainable development? There are many tools to use to move to deep decarbonization. And the two that are very often discussed are a carbon tax, where there would be a levy charged on each barrel of oil, each ton of coal, each cubic foot of natural gas that's used. Or alternatively, a permit system where a fixed number of permits each year would be granted. These permits would be tradable, and you would need a permit to emit carbon dioxide through the use of fossil fuels. There's been a lot of debate about which of these two approaches, tax or permit system, is better. My own thinking tends to go towards the tax approach because it's clearer, it's more transparent, and rather than having year-by-year permits, a tax system lends itself more easily to a full future time path of tax rates starting today and being clearly put perhaps out to 10 or 15 years to give guidance for long-term investment. So I think the tax approach is the simplest, actually, the most transparent, and would have a lot of effect. But it also should be said two things. One, we're very unlikely to get a global tax or a global tradable permit system. Rather, what we'll get most likely is individual countries making commitments of what they will do, but then using their own choice of policy instruments depending on their own institutional and legal framework. The second thing I would emphasize is that while both a permit system and a carbon tax system give a clear market incentive to move away from fossil fuels, they're not sufficient. They're not sufficient because we need to correct other problems as well. For example, a carbon tax or a trade permit system might give the incentive for a power company to move to solar power rather than to stay with the coal-fired plant. But unless that company is connected to a power grid that can connect the renewable energy to population markets, it won't matter because the ability to tap into intermittent renewable energy depends on a grid. But the simple price on carbon is not going to solve the problem of the national grid or even transnational grids in most places. Those are public policy decisions that go beyond a matter of price for carbon. In Germany, for example, the intention is to use wind power from the North Sea to power southern Germany. But to do that obviously requires a transmission grid from the North Sea all the way to Bavaria and other places in southern Germany. And the states along that potential transmission grid route don't want it. They don't want the power lines above their head. Pricing isn't changing that. That's a policy decision. Another example, we need improvements of technology. And a lot of that requires scientific research that would not be patent protected, for example. For that kind of R&D, research and development outlays, we need not simply a carbon tax, but a research and development program. Or to take another example, should a country use nuclear energy? About 30 countries in the world do so. Many countries are expanding nuclear. Others are saying, we don't want anything to do with it. But the price of carbon isn't going to settle that issue alone. It could affect it. It could nudge the country towards nuclear away from something else. But the choice of whether to have nuclear power or carbon capture and sequestration or offshore wind is not only a question of the pricing, it's also a question of the public's attitudes towards risk, towards other external effects of these technologies, towards the willingness to invest in new transmission networks and so forth. And therefore, this long-winded answer is to say that a permit system or a tax system is a useful tool, but it's not sufficient to make a full global or national policy on deep decarbonization. A full policy includes pricing carbon, research and development, land use policies, liability rules for issues like nuclear power, and public values and aesthetics in terms of power grid or putting wind turbines up or tapping into offshore energy. These are collective action problems where there are big differences of opinion, and each country, in my opinion, needs a deliberative process guided by a global treaty to say, yes, we're in, and here's our own deep decarbonization pathway, perhaps supported by permits or taxes, but all by a range of other policies. Ranajit asks, how do you think countries like China, who have overtaken the US in carbon emissions, perhaps India, which are inching towards it, will promote deep decarbonization of the economy? What do I think of the Green Climate Fund, and how should the fund be utilized? Up until now, China and India said, let the rich countries lead. I think that's changing quickly because the carbon arithmetic is so painful, and the size of in India today and the prospects for future emissions in the future, and by the way, the vulnerability of both China and India to human-induced climate change, means that those countries recognize they have a huge role to play in the global negotiations. I expect that both China and India will therefore be ready to sign an agreement in 2015, though they absolutely will say, we represent different levels of development. The US farthest advanced and richest, China in the middle, India poorer than China, but trying to catch up. And therefore, given our different levels of development and our different needs, we will have a different degree of responsibility, a different responsibility to help finance a climate decarbonization approach, different timelines, different targets, and so forth. In other words, an old expression called common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR, will still, in some sense, whether in those words or in a different way, play a role in the negotiations. But I do expect China and India to be at the table, to be constructive partners. Now, one area of joining the rich and the poor countries together is the so-called Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is the idea of pooling donor resources for the benefit of low-income countries that are undertaking policies both to mitigate climate change, that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to adapt to climate change by making their economies more resilient, or their agriculture more resilient, or their urban areas protected against storm surges, and so on. So the Green Climate Fund was established under the UNFCCC as a major financing instrument, pooling donor resources to help mitigation and adaptation efforts in low-income countries. A few years ago, actually in Copenhagen and then confirmed the next year in Cancun, the rich countries said they would contribute $100 billion per year by 2020 to facilitate mitigation and adaptation in the low-income countries. Part of that money will go through the Green Climate Fund, or GCF. Part of that money will go through the Global Environment Facility, or GEF. Part of it will go through other channels. This whole system of climate financing, in which the rich countries help the poor countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change, is unsolved. It's unsettled. It's one of the major areas of negotiation for 2015. There will actually be 2 stops in those negotiations. In July 2015, there will be an international conference on financing for development in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where these finance for climate will be taken up, these finance issues for climate. Then, of course, in Paris at COP21, many financial agreements will have to be reached more definitively. The Green Climate Fund should be a major instrument of support, and even if it's not putting out $100 billion a year, it should be intermediating tens of billions of dollars per year from the rich countries to the poor countries. But the rich countries have not stepped forward yet with tens of billions of dollars a year for the poor countries. And given our age of greed, they seem a little bit unlikely to do so unless pushed very, very hard. So I believe that we need a clear system of responsibility where it's not just a voluntary contribution by governments, but an assessment. We make an assessment for the International Monetary Fund, called the IMF quota rule, or an assessment for the World Bank, or an assessment for the central budget of the United Nations. We need an assessment for the Green Climate Fund as well. And I think it should be based on how much greenhouse gas emission each country commits and on the level of the economic development of the country. So rich countries would do more than poor countries. Major emitting economies would do more than low emitting economies in terms of their financing. And a formula would be worked out, and that could be done in many ways, that would incorporate these 2 main dimensions, income per capita and emissions of the country, into the overall level of financing for pooled funds like the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I'm sorry for starting a little bit late, but I want to thank everybody for superb questions on climate change. I'm glad that we focused this time on this major topic. It is a huge one. I'm off to the United Nations right now, actually, to have discussions about climate change throughout the afternoon. All eyes are on the process leading up to COP20 in Lima, which will be December 1 through 12. And then that is to put on the table a draft negotiating agreement for COP21 in Paris in December 2015. The stakes are high. You're all becoming experts on this. Excellent questions. We'll pick up on these themes and others in a new Google Hangout very soon. Stay tuned, watch for the announcements, and enjoy the course. Thank you very much.